This week, let's go back in time and revisit the conflict between the United States and Iran that erupted right as this year and this new decade started. An Iranian general was assassinated and basically all hell broke loose. So why this general, why now, and what does this mean in the long run? Let's dive in. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So look, this episode is going to be heavier on the general story of the United States and Iran and what happened a few weeks ago, but I want to keep in context the fact that the story of Iran is very closely tied to the story of Israel and to the story of Jewish communities all around the world. And that's something we're going to come back to, but first, let's hit the facts of what exactly happened. So at the end of 2019, in the very final weeks and days, Iraq started to heat up with skirmishes between American and American allied forces and Iran-sponsored militia groups. One of those Iraqi groups, called Kataib Hezbollah, attacked an Iraqi military base on December 27th and killed American and Iraqi troops. In response, the U.S. sent in airstrikes to the parts of Iraq and Syria where Kataib Hezbollah operates. And in response to that, on December 31st, as the new year was just coming in, Kataib Hezbollah stormed the American embassy in Baghdad, the capital of Iraq. And that was honestly very scary. I follow a variety of national security experts and journalists who cover the Middle East on Twitter, and they were sharing and posting videos and photos of this militia breaking through the gates of the embassy compound. Iraqi troops mostly stood by and let it happen. American military and civilian personnel were quite literally trapped in the embassy for a period of time. Thankfully, Iraqi forces did step in eventually, and Kataib Hezbollah backed off of the embassy. But the image is bad for the United States. Not only that, it recalls another famous moment when an American embassy was taken over in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And this gets to some of the deep-seated animosity between Iran and the United States. Before 1979, Iran was controlled by a parliament and an emperor in Persian called the Shah, a guy named Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Now, after World War II, Iran's economy was largely controlled by and tied to American and British oil companies who exploited Iranian oil reserves for themselves. Naturally, not all Iranians were satisfied with that arrangement. So in 1953, Mohammad Mossadegh, a secular Iranian politician, was elected as Prime Minister of Iran and led an effort to nationalize Iranian oil, or basically to take control of the oil away from Western companies and give it to the Iranian government. Now, when this happened, America and Great Britain flipped out, and the CIA worked with the MI6 British intelligence agency to overthrow Mossadegh, give control of Iranian oil back to American and British companies, and give more power in Iran to the Shah to avoid the parliament doing anything like this again. And the fact that America did this was not forgotten in Iran. So after 1953, the Shah modernized Iran and modernized Iran's economy, but he was also an authoritarian who imprisoned and tortured many of his own people. And again, all of this was done with the support of the CIA and the United States. So protests and a revolution brewed and eventually blew up in early 1979. In January of that year, the Shah fled Iran for the last time and went to, you guessed it, America. In February, the popular Iranian Islamic leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, came back to Iran after years in exile. In April, Iran became an Islamic republic by a popular referendum vote, and Ayatollah Khomeini became Iran's supreme leader. And then in November, Iranian students who had been protesting at the United States Embassy because of all of the aforementioned U.S. interventions in Iran and cooperation with and sheltering of the Shah, stormed the United States Embassy in Iran and took hostages that were only released after 444 days. To Iranians, this embassy takeover was beyond justified. To the United States, the Iranian hostage crisis was massively damaging to the image of America's strength in the world. And to have that scene of an embassy takeover replay in the last hours of 2019 in Iraq, this time by an Iran-sponsored militia, well, that's just absolutely intolerable to American officials. And I'll just say, I'm not confident that President Trump has the brainpower to actually understand the image of a repeat of 1979. But he seems to have understood that an enemy taking over your embassy is bad. So in response to the embassy storming in Iraq, he ordered an airstrike on January 3rd that killed the leader of Kataib Hezbollah and Iran's main man in organizing proxy groups and working to control the Middle East, General Qasem Soleimani, as they were driving in a convoy in Iraq. So Soleimani had been the commander of the elite Quds Force, which is basically Iran's equivalent of the CIA, and was considered by many to be the second most powerful person in Iran, if not the region, behind current Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. So this was no small assassination, and it threw the region into total uncertainty. Now, there are a lot of elements to what happened next. First, there were the actual ramifications. So number one, Iran began firing rockets at American bases and claimed that U.S. troops had been killed when in fact none had been killed, which is a kind of cop-out strategy to save face and to avoid further conflict. This is a strategy that terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Lebanon have also used. Number two, the rhetoric war amped up, with Iran warning the United States about any further action and Trump saying he was standing by to destroy important Iranian cultural sites with airstrikes, something he eventually said he wouldn't do. Incidentally, targeting cultural sites in war happens to be illegal, as the United States signed the Hague Convention in 1954 and the U.S. Armed Forces hold by that signing. Number three, the political fallout started in the United States as Trump had gone ahead and killed Soleimani without informing Congress or congressional leaders at all, though he had spoken about the strike with Russia's President Vladimir Putin. In an unusually bipartisan uproar, representatives and senators, Republicans and Democrats, were incredibly angry that Trump had not consulted with Congress before the airstrike and became even angrier after getting intelligence briefings from the White House about why Soleimani had been killed. And this is actually part of a bigger, more complicated point. The United States has laws about who it can and can't kill and why and when and with what level of oversight. Basically, killing an Iranian general because an Iranian proxy militia had stormed the U.S. embassy in Iraq is not exactly on the list of things that are just legal to do. And the White House has given no clear evidence or reason for why Soleimani was killed. We'll actually come back to this point in a moment. Number four, the Iraqi parliament voted to expel American troops from Iraq. Though what passed was a non-binding resolution, it's still very unnerving, particularly as American troops have been working to fight the terrorist group ISIS and make sure they don't take over Iraq again. And actually related to that, number five, Washington Post Beirut bureau chief Liz Sly tweeted that, quote, the U.S. military says it has paused anti-ISIS operations in Iraq, citing rocket attacks on bases, that would be from Iran, where troops are hosted. Sly also included a quote from the military that reads, this has limited our capacity to conduct training with partners and to support their operations against ISIS. We have therefore paused these activities, end quote. And number six, all of these things were brought to a standstill when, on January 8th, Iran accidentally shot down a Ukrainian civilian plane and killed 176 people. Now, at the same time, in this 5-day window from January 3rd, when General Soleimani was killed, to January 8th, when the Ukrainian plane was shot down, Americans, overall, people, real people, flipped out. And this is important to understand because it showcases how little Americans tend to understand about the Middle East. So, for example, some people said, well, General Soleimani was a bad guy, so it's good that he was killed, period, full stop. This was a common point from right-wingers. Now, I don't actually disagree with that sentiment, but it was used as a response against legitimate concerns about the legality of the assassination and against legitimate concerns about the Trump administration having any sort of plan for what comes after you kill a highly important Iranian general. And honestly, no one was confident that the Trump administration knew how they were going to deal with the fallout of such a decision when Trump has based his presidency on ignoring expert advice from military and national security experts and doing whatever sounds or looks good to him, regardless of the consequences. Which overall boils down to some people not understanding that solving problems in the Middle East is not just about killing the people you think are bad. Now, other people protested the killing of Soleimani as an act of American imperialism and came out in person to protest on January 4th, the day after he was killed. This is something that came overwhelmingly from left-wingers and progressives, and curiously, this is what I saw many Syrian and Iraqi activists and journalists get really angry about, more so than the response from right-wingers. And this ties into the reality that the Middle East is more of a gray area than a black and white American invasion and imperialism versus brown people hot take. Iran is an imperialist and expansionist regime. It has infiltrated Iraq, supported Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad as he massacres his own people in the Syrian civil war, destabilized Lebanon, and has thrown weapons at Yemen. There's a bigger conversation here about the many, many regional actors in the Middle East who are responsible for war and conflict, but the point I'm trying to get at is a short-sightedness that came up again and again on the American left when it came to reacting to and understanding the death of Soleimani and what Iran is doing in the Middle East. Here's something Sarah Hunaidi, a Syrian writer and human rights activist who was exiled from Syria in 2014, wrote on Twitter in response to the American protests against the killing of Soleimani. Quote, "So let me get this straight. People demonstrated in 70 cities in the United States today against the U.S. intervening in the Middle East against Iran, but how many times have people demonstrated when Iran intervened in places like Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, killing thousands of innocent people? I did not hear one chant from the anti-war demonstrations today against Iran's interventions and wars. Only about the U.S. and/or general anti-war slogans. Our blood as Syrians, Iraqis, and Lebanese in the past decade on Iran's hands did not deserve your attention? Not surprising. Some Syrians have been celebrating, people who've been exiled because Assad kicked them out of their own homes with Iran's help. They later saw pictures of Soleimani walking over the rubble of their homes. They didn't celebrate because they are pro-United States, but because we have not seen any justice since 2011. End quote. Which is a point I just want to reiterate clearly, even as I move on to the last part of this podcast. It's easy to talk about, Iran versus the United States or Iran working in Syria, but what that actually means and has meant is people on the ground, Iraqis, Syrians, and others, caught in the crossfire as their world burns and wondering what comes next. And incidentally, what comes next is also where a lot of Americans got it wrong, as many people panicked about a full-scale war between the United States and Iran. Again, that's just not how the Middle East or Iran operate, and that's crucial to understand. Elizabeth Tsurkov, a researcher who has spent extensive time in Syria and Iraq, summed it up by tweeting, quote, "The top priority for all authoritarian regimes is clinging to power. Starting a war with the world's superpower is suicidal. The Iranian regime cannot afford a war against the United States." End quote. And this is finally where this story ties more directly back to Jews and to Israel. Because Iran won't take on the United States directly. It will take its time, and it will use terrorism to strike back, and it will aim at easy targets and allies, which historically have been Israelis and Jews. Americans tend to think in terms of war, all-out war, but that's just not how Iran sees it. Here's what Iranian-American journalist Yashar Ali tweeted, quote, "The Iranian government has always operated on its own timeline. For example, in 2012, assassins kill an Iranian nuclear chemist, likely directed by Israel. Iran promises revenge. Where does the ultimate revenge take place? A month later, in Georgia, India, and Thailand, where Israeli diplomats were targeted by bombs. Another example, in 1992, the Israeli Defense Forces killed the Secretary General of Hezbollah. Where did Iran retaliate? In Buenos Aires in Argentina, with a truck bomb driven into the Israeli embassy. That attack killed 29 people. Another attack 2 years later took place at the Jewish Community Center, killing 85 people. If people think that this is it, that Iran has chosen to retaliate against the United States for killing the second most powerful man in Iran by lobbing some missiles across the border that didn't result in U.S. casualties, then I have a bridge to sell you." End quote. And here's what Mark Polymeropoulos, a retired CIA agent, had to say on Twitter as well. Quote, "Iran terrorist reach is global. Latin America, Africa, Europe, and the US. They will seek soft targets. They will use Hezbollah, the A-team of terrorist groups. Americans are at risk everywhere. It's a price we will pay for this. Iranian proxy Hezbollah makes al-Qaeda look like the junior varsity team of the terrorist lineup. Not to be alarmist, but always presumed Iran has off-the-shelf plans for just this contingency." End quote. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a positive takeaway for this episode of the podcast. This is a situation that is serious and that continues to play out, and we have to pay attention to it and understand it as best we can. And at a certain level, we can only hope that the United States, despite current political turmoil, is set up well enough to still be able to protect its citizens. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.